Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Tony. I'm a project analyst at Buildaberg, and we are a planning, design, construction firm operating out of Weaverville in the entire Emerald Triangle. We've been really lucky to take on several clients here in Mendocino County in the last few months, and we do a lot of CEQA work. We wanted to put on this workshop because we've been hearing a lot about the drought, a lot of data, a lot of opinion pieces about the drought. Everyone knows that there's a drought, and I don't think that's something we need to debate, right now. But what we really want to talk about is strategies for making it through the drought, for your grow, for your project, for your business. And we have a really great panel here today who's going to help us talk about that. On our panel, get over to my slides. Oh, here's the hydrology cycle. But we have Jacob, Tom, Patty, and Scott who are here to talk with us about some strategies for water savings, some information about water policy. And Scott is going to talk a lot about water storage and rainwater catchment systems, and some data and information about how you can figure out how much water you're going to need, how much water you can store from your rainwater catchment system. It's really good information. But to kick it off, we're going to start with Jacob, who is a farmer in Hayampom, has a beautiful grow out there, and is using some really exciting bioregenerative methods. And I'm really excited to hear more from him. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Jacob. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, I'm Jacob from Flower Days Farm in Hayampom, and I'm also the author of the Flower Days Farm Regenerative Guide to Cannabis. And so natural farming and drought-conscious farming has been, a focus of our project for 7 years now. And so even pre-legalization, we were focusing on how are we going to deal with strategies to deal with drought in the changing landscape of California. So the number one thing we're trying to do on our farm is store water in the land, in reservoirs. Storage is the number one thing we're thinking about. Sorry, I've had a kind of busy morning, so if it takes me a second to get my train of thought and get going, just bear with me. But for fire protection, for farming, these are things that California is dealing with. We've been dealing with them for a while. Everybody's been saying, well, if you have a groundwater well, that's going to be your ticket to doing this kind of thing. And we're just seeing that that's not the case. I know a lot of people this year have had groundwater wells start to dry up. They've had their springs start to dry up. Surface water is limited in many places. So how are you going to actually get through the season without these things available? And so the key to that is storing water. And there are a lot of different ways to do it. I mean, as a farmer, I'm a big advocate of, a lot of these solutions can be done on the farm on your own as a farmer, from mulching, from using different kinds of mulch like wood chips, adding more biomass, building swales that store water that rains in the land all winter long, all the way up to building reservoirs, which you would need permits for to store larger amounts of water through the dry season. And we're fortunate enough in California that we are allowed to store rainwater. There are many Western states where rainwater is not an option, like in Colorado and places like that. So even though we have had a limited amount of rainwater, we've been able to store enough water for our use on our farm for cannabis to last the season. And especially in a year like this, where our house has a limited amount of water, we're able to water our cannabis garden pretty much like, not quite like normal, but almost. And so, if we hadn't been forward thinking in developing these systems, I can guarantee that we wouldn't have a crop at all last year or this year. And so as California starts changing the rules on how they manage water, these kinds of things are going to start affecting a lot of different farmers too. And so when you have a big fire coming and then you're already limited, it's fortunate feeling to have thought ahead and put in the storage and know that you can do a little work, or that the firefighters will feel like they want to support you because you have some storage and you're able to provide that for them. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of our project. In general, when we're doing this kind of work, it's all very site specific. It's tailored to each landscape. So it's not the easiest to say what works for me will work for you, but we're always trying to keep gravity in mind when we're designing these systems. How does water flow from the high point to the low point? Ideally, if you can put your storage at the high point and your garden at the low point, when PG&E shuts the power off, you're ready to go to keep farming like it's any other day. And out in Heim Palm here, we're pretty much in such a remote area that it is like any other day when the power goes off. So that's kind of a relief. We've been dealing with that this summer. We've had 10 days without power, and what do? You're going to be running generators. You're going to be running gas. Like if you have the forethought to put these systems in place before you need them, they're there and then they're functioning when you need them. And as a farmer, that's crucial. And in these changing times, there's not really much I feel like you can rely on except yourself in a lot of ways. So that's kind of my introduction to what I think Scott wants to talk about, with more specifically harvesting rainwater. When we get to the Q&A, I have a lot of practical and if anybody has any questions, I can provide practical experience answers to any questions anybody might have about actually farming with a storage-based rainwater system in California, before California is about to mandate that for everybody.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate hearing from you. I think it's great to start with kind of like a case study of somebody who is implementing all of these practices that we're going to talk about and really seeing some success. So thank you, Jacob. We're going to move on to Tom Hicks, who's an attorney and a water rights enthusiast and expert. And we'll go ahead and take it away, Tom.
Well, good morning to everybody. And again, keeping track of fires around the state. I know we're all just thinking of Jacob in particular and people up on Trinity. There's no place to hide. And something that Jacob said about forward thinking is really where I'm going to start my remarks. Water rights and such. I've heard maybe some of the audience have also heard, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time is today. A lot of what we're talking about here isn't going to do much good for anybody if they hadn't thought about these things beforehand in the middle of a drought. But I would hope that part of what we're able to impress upon anybody in the audience is that if you really have a long-term view to be in the cannabis growing business on the North Coast, you have to do it with a legal entitlement to use that water. And there's not enough time here to cover all the aspects of water rights. Thank you, Tony, for bringing up the Layperson's Guide to Water Rights, a publication by the California Water Education Foundation. I'm proud to say I'm a co-author. But what we're really getting at here are many people are familiar with appropriative water rights that came out of the gold mining experience. Use it or lose it. Other people might have heard, oh yeah, riparian rights. They're part and parcel of the land. They're never lost for non-use. And groundwater, of course, has been such a reservoir for any overlying landowner. You have until 2014 had virtually the unlimited right to take as much water as you can pump from underneath your property. Whether it affects other neighbors or whether it runs out is almost secondary to your ability to do what you want with the resource. But to kind of focus into the modern drought, we're just seeing pressure points from a number of different directions. Again, I do a fair amount of work, not just within the cannabis community, but within the public interest community. Entities and agencies trying to enhance stream flow for the benefit of salmonids, steelhead, coho, chinook. The North Coast is a salmon stronghold, but even in the middle of a drought, it is being hammered. There are only so many refugia where, whether it be the Upper Russian or the Eel Rivers, everywhere you look, there just isn't much water. So how the cannabis community digs in is really in a matter of ways that they can be fish-friendly type farmers, recognizing that taking water directly out of a stream in July and August is going to be increasingly unlikely, increasingly uncertain as we go into water year scenarios where we're having below normal precipitation for multiple years in a row. I represent some people in northwestern Slow County. They had a reservoir and they had a 14-inch rain over 24 hours in the end of January this year. And that was the only rain they got for the year, but their cup was filled. A complete anomaly that didn't occur anywhere else. It just came out of the ocean. So I think that's really the theme of this panel, is just to rainwater catchment. Others will talk more about that. There are ways that you can permit without having to get an appropriative right to store water for more than 30 days. That's the kind of the technical term or trigger for an entity like the State Water Resources Control Board. Some of you may have heard of them or have had direct experience with them. There's also the Regional Water Quality Control Board, which really originated a lot of the modern push for water use compliance on the North Coast especially. And then of course, many of you have heard of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. All these entities have different interests, and for farmers to somehow, after they go through the compliance and the work with consultants, what are the applications, all the permitting, what's getting approved? It's the approvals that can demonstrate that there's no direct infringement on the flow conditions that are already imperiling endangered species. I think there's a real opportunity for the best management practices of the cannabis industry to showcase an ethos where the independence, the integrity, the resilience of each farmer in this region, it's done with an ecological consciousness that recognizes that all these actions that I take to drip irrigation or otherwise will leave more water in the stream for the fish. But more practically, there are ways that forward-thinking cannabis entrepreneurs and farmers can take matters into their own hands. It could be stormwater that kind of rolls off of hillsides and is collected. It could be rainwater. It could be seeking to pump and store water for more than 30 days, but taking water during the peak flow months during the winter. All these things can be done in ways that require technical and kind of upfront consulting. Again, Patty will talk a little bit about the RCD, but there are resources out there to make sure that the farmers who take these responsibilities seriously can get their ticket punched and thrive in the middle of dry times. I think that's it.
Great, thank you, Tom. I'm going to pass it over to Patty. And
Tony, I would add, I might not be able to be here at the end for all the questions and answers, so I just apologize to anyone in the audience if they are unable to get through me. Maybe you can connect us if they have any questions afterward.
yeah, I'm happy to connect folks with Tom by email if anyone would like to connect with him directly. So let me know in the chat and we'll get you guys connected for sure. Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate your time. Okay, over to Patty. Go ahead and
Thanks, Tony. There is a saying, and I want to say it was Mark Twain who said that, yes, water does run downhill, except for in California, where it runs uphill towards money. So, water storage is very expensive and it's a great practice, but the best time to plan for a drought is before the drought happens. And so we've known in California that the drought is cycling, that it's not ever going to go away. We may have some wet years, but our dry periods are increasingly harsh, and our salmon runs are increasingly imperiled, and so are our cannabis farmers, to be quite frank. Mendocino County is about 60% forest land. And we don't have a lot of flat agricultural land. We have a lot of rangeland, a lot of forest land, and most of our cannabis farms are in rural communities that have some limited access, and they have some limited flat ground. And so a lot of them are small, outdoor, sun-grown farms that have a lot of community connections and pride. And they are, for the most part, really good stewards of the land. They've been farming for generations now, and they have developed some coping mechanisms and some best management practices. And this publication that is up now is the first best management practices or outreach done by a public agency, we think, in the United States. It might be just California, but we got funding from the State Water Resources Control Board through the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board in 2015 to develop this BMP guide for cannabis and other rural gardeners. It's available in English and Spanish, and it has been updated recently through some generous funding from the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, as well as the North Coast Resources Partnership. And I'm just going to call those folks out. Resource conservation districts have been around since the Dust Bowl era. We're both a state agency and a local public agency, and we're non-regulatory. We try to work with all working landscapes, and we work with legal cannabis, but anybody can come to our workshops. Anybody can access our resources. We're developing a new program called GRASC, which stands for Growing Responsible and Socially Sustainable Cannabis, which is a self-assessment followed up with an RCD verification. And we will be adapting that to the North Coast needs of the cannabis community. Just saying that in general, the RCD in Mendocino County works on flow enhancement for all different kinds of human and natural resources needs. And we have put in quite a few large tank systems, up to 100,000 gallons or more. We've also done some cost benefit analysis about ponds versus storage. And we don't put in a lot of plastic tanks. One of the reasons for that is that although they cost less, they have some longevity issues. So they might be a good short-term solution, but we go towards metal tanks, even though they're a little more expensive and require different installation. Some of them need a cement concrete pad, and some of them can go on a gravel pad. But they do need to be somewhat engineered. And so that's a limitation for tanks. The also cost can go up to $2 per gallon. So if you're talking about 100,000 gallon tank, that's a pretty cost prohibitive without grant funding to support the installation of something like that. Ponds are about half the cost, I'd say, per gallon, somewhere between 85 cents and $1 per gallon to store water. But with a pond, you have to make sure you're off stream because the regulatory agencies will not permit on-stream ponds generally. If you have one that's been grandfathered in, good for you. I'm not sure how that will muster with permitting, but maybe somebody either on the panel or in the audience can tell us what their experiences have been with on-stream ponds, but we don't recommend those as a solution, or it just can put you in a regulatory hassle. With ponds, there's evaporation and there's also a lot of maintenance, because if you have a pond liner, you pretty much need to fence that pond. And there's, maintenance in terms of water quality, both, maintaining your pond and maintaining the systems that, you're pumping with. And I agree, locating a pond uphill is the best thing for gravity fed, but most properties don't have a lot of places where you can put a pond. So unless you have a large property, you're going to put a pond where you can, not where you necessarily want it. And so solar panels are a good option for pumping. I really recommend that you meter your water, that you use low flow emitters. People have mentioned the mulching, that's really important. But also I'd like to say that, in the early days, everyone seemed to be growing out of grow bags, and the farms that I'm visiting that are using best management practices are planting right in the ground. They're using companion planting. They're amending the soil. Improving the soil will improve its water holding capacity. There's many ways, and some of our guidance documents can talk about that. But resource conservation districts work through grants. So where possible, we can do some outreach and work with the cannabis community without a cost associated with it, or just general site visits and recommendations. But to really dig deep and develop a project, we do work on a fee-for-service basis similar to consultants, but we in no way want to compete with consultants. We just want to make sure that people are getting good information. And so I think my contact information, I can leave it in the chat, and I'm happy to pass it to the next person. I think that's you, Scott.
Well, thanks, Patty. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and drop some of the links that you sent me in the chat.
Okay.
And end this poll. Go ahead and close that.
And I just want to say that not every RCD has embraced cannabis like Mendocino County, but as my husband said when he married me, I'd be a fool not to. We have so much cannabis in Mendocino County, and we want them all to have a much easier pathway to legalization and assistance. We believe that every farmer who's doing the right thing should have the same resources that a grape grower or a market garden or conventional farming folks have.
It's really awesome. Yeah, thank you for sticking with it. I know that there's a lot of work to be done. A lot of damage has been done, but there's also some really great stewards of the land out there, and it's important that we support them. So yeah, thank you so much, Patty. I'm going to hand it over to Scott, who's going to talk about water storage. Did you want to start here with the forbearance period, Scott?
Sure, yeah.
Sure. All right, take it away.
I don't see the slides, Tony.
My bad. Let me
No worries.
kind of share my screen. There we go.
Okay, so I always like to point back to the regulation and let the regulation help dictate the design and the plan of any farm that we work on. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of the clauses in the water board general order that I think a lot about. These are probably common to most folks, but I wanted to go ahead and put them out there so that we could all be on the same page with the forbearance period, the water storage and use, and then ultimately the surface water diversions on the next slide that set the forbearance period, which is April 1st through October 31st. That basically means that there's 152 days in the winter period to be collecting water from surface water diversions, which is an important number to think about. And I'll get back to that in a second. One thing I want to caution everybody about is if you do see or hear a good idea, please don't implement it right away. You do need to be mindful of the California Environmental Quality Act and getting your project description together and getting that approved before you make changes on the ground. And that, that could be seen as kind of a barrier, but I also like to see it as an opportunity. You can plan your project and you don't necessarily have to build it all out immediately. What CEQA does is it sets kind of your glass ceiling, and then you have the flexibility to grow into it over time. You don't have to do it all, day one. So on the next slide, you'll be able to see some different pictures I've taken of surface water diversions. Not all of these are legal, but I think that this is kind of the past, and I think looking forward, folks are going to start doing things maybe a little bit more in line with professional standards. And on the next slide is when we start getting into a little bit of the data. This is a groundwater well. I'd like to hear if there's time at the end, maybe Patty or Tom can talk about the difference between a groundwater well and the depth, whether it's a surface water diversion at a certain depth or when it becomes a true groundwater well, which I believe there's 100-foot threshold to be called a groundwater well, but I've also heard 80 feet. So I'd love personally to get a little bit of clarity on that. But what I did here is I calculated out how much 1 gallon per minute, 3 gallons per minute, and 10 gallons per minute can yield within that 152-day winter period. It's pretty remarkable that a 10-gallon water per minute. Now, this is, if that well is humming and it is producing and storing every second of that 152 days, 2.1 million gallons with a 10-gallon per minute well. And I've seen some wells produce, 25 gallons a minute. We've got one client that's got, over 25 million gallons of water available to them through groundwater wells. Now, should they pump all that? Probably not. Which is why on the next slide, we get into rainwater catchment. We pretty much put rainwater catchment in every single project that we do, just to kind of reduce the impact of groundwater extraction. And how we do that is we use PRISM from Oregon State. And this is based on quad maps. And this is this quad map here has actually got some wildfire in it today. But it's for one of our clients, Hayfork Connect. And we just kind of looked at the last 10 years of water availability. And, we see 2013 actually has less water than 2020. In any event, on the next slide, you'll see how we use this data. And we kind of set, that 10-year peak, average, and drought year. So we see how much water we can collect, based on high, medium, and low, so to speak. And you can see I've got arrows here. This square footage that we're collecting on for Hayfork Connect is extremely small. There's a lot more greenhouses and really surface area that's available to collect water on most sites. We've got one site that's got 20,000 square feet of greenhouse surface area, in addition to residential houses and pretty much anything we can collect off, we do collect off of. And then, then it becomes a matter of what do you do with that stored water? And I want to talk about some of these different storage options. As Jacob mentioned, what works for one farm may not work for another. So I want to really talk about a few different storage options, including tanks. And these are kind of smaller tanks, ranging from 2,500 gallons to 5,000. But we're also going to dig in here in a second into water bladders, pond reservoirs, and things like that. And what I've done is I've broken down the cost based on 100,000 gallons for each of the storage types, but there are definitely hidden costs here that I didn't put out. as Patty just mentioned a minute ago, for these larger tanks, you've got, a gravel foundation or a concrete foundation that's likely to be required, likely going to be some engineering. Your permit's going to be a little bit more expensive. So I didn't really dig into those figures too much, but I just wanted to give you a general benchmark of where to look at, okay, for just the tank, how much is it going to cost? And here on this next slide, I added that up. I also put in what the footprint of these would be, because like Jacob said, each site is different. So one site may be better off for the 2,500 gallon tanks and you can spread them out. And again, just because you say I need 100,000 gallons doesn't mean you need all those today. You can kind of build into that. And so that's what the 2,500 gallon or the 5,000 gallon tanks are good for, is you can kind of, okay, this year we're going to buy, 12 more. Next year we're going to buy 20 more. Whereas the larger tank, you got to absorb all that cost up front. And this 56,000 bid is from Pioneer Water Tanks. It's a live bid for a live project. But when you look at the footprint, it's much smaller than if you add up all these 2,500 gallon tanks. So it's a larger area in a single tank, but it's smaller overall, cumulative. And then on the next slide, we can see a water bladder. Now, this is not how you want to install a water bladder, because if it pops, then you're going to have a lot of water coming down towards that house. Instead, you're going to want to have a water bladder. And in the next slide, you can see a couple different retention methods. You need 110% capacity. So you can do that with a dirt berm, a polyliner, you can do subterranean like the slide on the right. But then I also broke down what the cost is for each of these different size bladders. And again, gave the footprint. You can go with 2,500 gallon liners. Those are a little bit cheaper to get, but you got to have a lot of them. Also, you need additional area for access and maintenance. So the water bladders really can add up quick to the amount of surface area that they take up. I've seen the water bladders, many different methods of where people put them. I've even seen one right next to a stream with no secondary containment, and that's obviously you can't do that. The next slide, we get in a little bit into ponds. Here's a couple of natural ponds that are built into the natural topography of the sites. And one thing to keep in mind, Fish and Wildlife may require like bullfrog management plans, or you may need to have, I think there's Western pond turtle is another thing CDFW looks for, and there's one other one that I can't remember off the top of my mind. But with this, you may actually need to drain your pond every other year in order to manage a bullfrog population. And in those kinds of cases, we would recommend siting 2 ponds. That way you're able to rotate the draining of the ponds from, odd years and even years. One year you drain one, the other year you drain the other. And that way you use the water in one pond first, if that's the one that's going to drain that year. And then you kind of bounce over to the other one. And I think that that's a really important drought management strategy, in that you can have carryover of water, because some years, as you saw on the Prism slide, you're going to have up to 5 feet of rain. And then other years you're going to maybe have a foot. So that ability to carry over your water supply, I think, is a really valuable lesson. On the next slide, this is a massive pond that we had one of our clients put in. It is just over 1 acre in size. You can see on the bottom right-hand side that there's an overflow channel, which is also used as a wildlife escape, which is important. You've always got to be thinking about wildlife getting in and out. I know that Patty mentioned a minute ago, if you've got a lined pond, you really need to have a fence around it. I hear that, and I agree with that. It's not always followed in practice. So you have to have the ability for wildlife to escape. One other strategy I wanted to mention is, and this is something I'd like to debate if Tom and Patty are still on the line during the Q&A. We absolutely want to collect every ounce of rainwater that we can. But we also in our projects like to give flexibility to the project any way we can. So we actually have started saying off-stream ponds are better. That way you're able to fill up that pond with rainwater or any other water depending on the rainfall per year. So I think maybe Tom could help guide us through what that means for the paperwork side of things. But that's another strategy that I'm really fond of. And on the next slide, we've got a side view of that same gigantic 1 acre pond. And I think that this is an important thing to realize is just because you want to have a pond, that doesn't mean that you may be qualified out because you've got some slope to your property. The ponds can actually, work with whatever slope you have. This is a fairly gentle slope, but you can see, they cut and fill the berms on the side, so they don't dig all the way down. They kind of dig as deep as they need given the topography, and then build up berms on the sides. Of course, with these types of ponds, you are going to need an engineer, and when you're thinking about your water storage and controlling water loss, you have to be thinking about both up and down for evaporation and seepage. And that's not as big of a deal when you have to deal with tanks, but it's extremely important that you're calculating evaporation and seepage depending on the type of pond that you have. So let's first focus on natural ponds and seepage. So a natural pond, I'm not going to get into different soil types. I can talk about this stuff all day, but what's important is that the different soil types are going to permeate water at different rates. And on the next slide, we really want to highlight clay soils. Clay soils are going to hold water a little bit better than those sandy soils. And as long as you can use clay soils as kind of a liner, you can do all kinds of other like natural methods for holding that water besides clay. But now that you know that, maybe you can do some more research, or we can do another presentation about really dialing into natural ponds. The other side of it on the next slide is pond liners. Now, again, this is a quick estimate, a live estimate that I got for a project. This is a 130 by 130 foot pond liner, which would allow a 100 foot by 100 foot by 12 feet deep pond. That capacity is that's a little under 900,000 gallons. So you can see here in green that there's a couple different mill pond liners. So the thinner ones, like that 12 milliliter or milliliter, that 12 ml, that's going to be a thinner liner. And if you've got like dogs jumping in your pond or deer or things like that, I mean, that thing's going to rip pretty quick. Now, the pond liner underlayment, which is in gold at the bottom, is highly recommended no matter what type of pond liner you have. But if you've got a lot of animals and things, you really want to make sure you have a thicker liner. So let's talk a little bit about evaporation and controlling water loss up in the air. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to summarize this very easily for you. I did all these calculations and I was going to go have a deep dive into evaporation loss, but you don't need to know all that. What you need to know is you're going to have 15 to 26% loss. And the difference in that loss are going to be, whether your pond is under trees, it's got foliage, it's shaded in the morning or in the evening by a different topography. When we plan out sites, we're always looking at, okay, how can we minimize evaporation rates if we've got a pond? Okay, let's tuck it on this side of the property where we know there's less direct sunlight. And so you're going to be able to store more. But as a general rule of thumb, as you're digesting this information, I say ultra conservative is always how I default. So maybe 30% loss, and then you can calculate how much volume you need for a pond. And like I said a minute ago, the bladders and tanks, you're really going to have minimal loss. Maybe you can calculate a 5% loss. But all this water storage is for naught if you're not looking at the maintenance. And on the next slide, this is what drives me crazy. You can store all the water you want, but if you're not checking for leaks on, if not a daily, at least a weekly basis, this could, all that storage doesn't really mean anything. On top of that, moving from hand watering to low flow emitters with drip systems is definitely, I think everybody's pretty much figured this out. We typically go with drip systems on our projects, and then we augment with hand watering. So, you know, if there's one zone that's not getting enough water, you can go in there and blast it with a few minutes with a hose. But all of it's about managing the soil moisture level. And when I learned about cultivation back in 2016, I was kind of a late bloomer compared to some other folks in the group. You know, I was taught, hey, just stick your finger in the dirt, you know, and then you can tell how moist it is. But that's not the most precise method. And on the next slide, there's a couple of moisture monitors that more and more of our clients are starting to implement. You know, there's the cheap $10 one there on the left. Then they're getting more sophisticated. And these moisture monitors are going to increase the precision of knowing, you know, how much water your plants really need. And each strain is going to consume different amounts of water, different volumes of water. That's another reason why we provide that augmented watering. I've seen a lot, and I'm really excited about IoT-based smart irrigation monitoring systems. These are ones that are going to be able to control your watering based on the weather patterns. They're connected to the internet. And if there's a storm rolling in, they may shut off your water for a day or two. And that is a great water management strategy. They also, you know, they decrease water overflows. When I was out there living on a tent right next to the creek there and growing some plants in 2016, I can't tell you how many times I woke up and, you know, you burn one in the morning with your morning coffee and you go out there to do some watering, and all of a sudden you forget and you're like, holy cow, I just watered the heck out of this one plant. Well, these technology based management systems are going to really help a lot with that. On the next slide, this is just kind of to start a conversation. I know Jacob mentioned wood chips and mulching a few minutes ago. I think that that's a really excellent idea. And I think more and more people are doing this sort of straw or wood chips to increase soil moisture in extreme heat. I would love to hear from probably Patty, I would think, about the intersection of mulching and straw and pest management, because that's the last thing you want to do is, you know, create, you know, other issues for yourself because, you know, you're putting straw on, but then that creates root rot or brings in other bugs that now you have to manage. So you just have to keep all that kind of stuff in mind. The next is soil structure. And, you know, depending on the structure of your soil, you may be able to retain more water or less water. And again, sorry, Patty, I'm not trying to pick on you, but I think you have a lot of really great information when it comes to this type of thing. And perhaps Jacob can also talk a little bit more about inoculating the soil and how that can impact your water usage. And then I'll end on something that Patty mentioned a minute ago. I swear I'm not picking on you, Patty, but you just have such great ideas. But a water meter, everybody should have a water meter. I know that, you know, the water board requires you to report, requires each cultivator to report on their annual water use. And we see a lot of people just kind of thumbing how much water they use, but you really need to dial in how much water your particular cultivation method uses on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Because what I see, you know, I think I did, I don't know, 18 or more water board reports this last year. You know, we break them up between our whole team. But I saw a wide variety of different volumes of water that people were using. Some people were using just, okay, I fill up the tank every so often, and that's how I determine how much water I use. And I had one of our Hmong clients was mentioning, hey, you know, Scott, 7 a.m. I water for 15 minutes, 7 p.m. I water for 15 minutes, and that's how much I water. It's like, okay, well, I'm glad you're using low emitting, you know, drip lines, but, you know, do you know how much water that is on an annual basis? And then we had one client that we bought them a water monitor or a water meter for them to use, and they had it dialed in. They knew exactly how many gallons every single day throughout the whole growing season. And we saw some really cool trend analysis with, you know, June and July. That's when their numbers are really a lot higher. And so taking into consideration how much water you need, evaporation rates, how you step down your water use as you're getting closer to harvest, having all that data really helps manage your project. And all of it's going to be more and more important as we go forward in dealing with drought. So that's all I have, and hopefully we can have some Q&A, and I'm happy to backfill more information as needed.
Thank you, Scott. That was really great. I think there was a lot of really good information in there. Patty, did you want to respond to some of Scott's points?
Yeah, I am not an expert on pest management, but I do know that it's challenging because with legal cannabis, you're really prohibited from using the conventional agricultural methods of pest management, which I actually think is a good thing. I think that if our innovative farmers can show ways to do companion planting or do basically holistic pest management, it's going to show conventional agriculture that it can be done. So, I mean, you know, sometimes it's going to be hand picking those bugs off of cannabis leaves and things like that. But I think that would be a great topic for a future session, would be pest management. There are probably lots of different strategies that folks, in every year, it seems like it's a different pest. Okay, I'll just say that. But I know that, you know, like for me, I'm dealing with aphids at home, you know, and on my fruit trees, and it can be really disappointing because you can lose a whole, you know, tree or crop that way. So yeah, I will defer to experts on pest management, but you know, the cost benefit is probably weighing on water savings, I would say. So other strategies will probably need to be implemented. Other soil management techniques, I would have to also defer to soil health experts in my office. You know, what I've observed may not work for everybody. So thanks for the endorsement, Scott. But I'm not a farmer. So you know, I ask me about fish, ask me about you know, fish habitat or environmental education. and I'm happy to answer that.
I'm so sorry to put you on the spot.
As an expert, which, you know,
well,
which in the water world, an expert is a has-been drip, okay? An expert.
Okay, fair enough. Jacob, can you jump in?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with Patty that the water savings would outweigh the pest management component when you're using mulch. And if you are using companion plants in conjunction with mulching, you're going to actually find that you'll have a lot more predators in your mulch rather than a host of pests. So we see a lot of spiders there's probably 6 or 7 different species that I see in my garden. But there's specifically the grass spiders that really like to hang out in your mulch. They're going to deal with your root aphids or different kinds of extra silverfish or white flies and stuff like that can come up from your mulch. And then companion planting, you're going to be bringing in bigger predators. So we actually don't import any predator bugs, but we have a lot of spiders, a lot of praying mantis, a lot of ladybugs. We don't really have to worry about these things. We invite them, we create the habitat, and they come. So if you're doing light depths, you know, you might have a different issue in a greenhouse, and you know, where you need it to be a little bit cleaner. But really, rather than like getting rid of the mulch, just make sure you're picking up all of your leaves, that all of your prunings and stuff like that, keeping your hygiene like up a little bit more from working with the cannabis, but still promoting the diversity that you want. Because if you're bringing in toads, you're letting all of these guys come. They're going to do the work for you. You know, not to say that you don't need to help, but they do a lot to keep that from happening. And they're not going to be there if you don't have the habitat in the mulch and a few companion plants, things like that.
It's great information. Tom, did you want to talk a little bit about groundwater wells and the groundwater management plans?
I think everybody in their own way has touched on just the uncertainty that the drought presented us all the same challenge. If there's 0% precipitation, there's no magic that we can do without the water. But with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there are new groundwater sustainability plans that are going to be required to be in place that seek sustainable yield. A lot of these formulae for what is a sustainable yield, really, you have two different categories of groundwater. There's the type of groundwater that you might pump that's hydrologically connected to surface flow. Those are the ones that the agencies are most concerned about. And those are, we're going to see cases and other examples in the next couple of years of these regulations are being tested for the first time. How much local limitation can someone put on somebody's right to use water from underneath their property? It's going to be a fight. But I will say that to the extent that somebody has the capacity to drill a deeper well, it's in the so-called fractured bedrock. It's not in the alluvium or hydrologically connected to surface flow. You would at least have a technical argument to say you're using water that doesn't affect the fish. Those strategies, you might, if you have a diversified portfolio of water sources, rainwater, stormwater, diffuse flows, intermittent flows from streams. When there's a peak flow, you can store it. But then, again, surface flow that goes into groundwater, it's kind of the same resource. But if you have like a deeper well, they cost more. You want to get a return on that investment. You want to use that water, but you might only use that in certain situations where you must use, you have no other source. But it's a lot for everybody to navigate. It can be really expensive pretty quickly without any real tangible wet results. But I know that that's the peril of being a grower nowadays is you have multiple hurdles to jump through.
Yeah, that's right. I think something that's important to remember is that there are an incredible amount of regulators interested in cannabis projects, interested in where projects are getting their water from. I did see a question in the chat from Daryl. If CEQA applications, are flow meters being required on the new CEQA applications? Flow meters aren't really part of CEQA requirements, but I'll go ahead and let Scott speak a little bit about what should be in a CEQA initial study or project description regarding water and water use.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is CEQA is a disclosure document. It's not, there's no CEQA police. So including the fact that you monitor your water use with water meters, that's going to lower your environmental impact. And that's what CEQA is all about, is disclosing what your environmental impact is going to be. As Tom mentioned a second ago, if you can have sort of a mixture of sources of water, then that just says, hey, I don't have as big of an impact on my water source, a singular water source that you use and rely on. That's likely going to have a larger impact, especially if it's a surface water diversion. As Jacob mentioned in the intro, a lot of those rivers and streams are drying up, so they're just not reliable long-term sources. So you really want to have a mixture of many different sources, and then you disclose it through CEQA. CEQA is not saying you have to do one thing one way or another. It's just saying disclose the way that you choose to do things. And then hope that you don't get sued, because that's also a big part of CEQA. CEQA is a litigation tool. And that's the biggest fear in my mind is, you disclose something and then you get sued because of it. That's why we try, with Buildaberg, we try to make sure we're very precise in our disclosure. We try to use data to prove that we have low impacts, and not just say, hey, yeah, we have low impacts. Well, that's great, that's nice, but prove it. That's what CEQA is all about. It's about disclosure and making sure that you don't get sued.
Well, thank you. We lost Tom, but really appreciate that Tom was here. Patty, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to talk about water rights and permitting a little bit. Again, there's people who know a lot more about this than I do, but we've been working with non-cannabis conventional farmers and have found that even if you're using a spring And, it doesn't even matter if it's for your domestic use or whether it's part of your ag operation, is that the agencies are now wanting you to do some kind of a plan around, whether that spring is connected, and any well that's in the alluvial or the riparian area is subject to regulatory oversight by the agencies these days. So if you're trying to put in like a tank system and you're diverting water and forbearing during those dry periods, you're going to have to get a small irrigation use permit often. And all your other water sources come under scrutiny when you get the regulatory agency staff on your property. So the good thing about rainwater catchment is that you don't need to do a forbearance agreement. You are not, your property taxes don't increase because something was passed, I can't remember, AB something or other, was passed about 3 years ago that render rainwater catchment exempt from property taxes. So, those strategies, we have to kind of like look at multiple strategies, but we also have to know that some of the things that we think are okay, like if you're in a groundwater monitoring, groundwater sustainability basin that's being regulated, you might need to use alternative measures to rather than groundwater. So groundwater is not everybody's solution. Yeah. So, and then in terms of where surface water stops and groundwater starts, I think that 100-foot is probably as good a number as any, but it's going to be variable. And people who have shallow wells that are in the riparian area are going to be very vulnerable to regulatory oversight. So just a few things to keep in mind.
Great. That's really great insight. Thank you. Okay, I want to open it up to Q&A. If anyone has questions, you can either unmute yourself or drop them in the chat and I'll read it for you. We'll go ahead and give you a couple minutes to think if you have any questions for our panelists. I'll play the Jeopardy theme song. I don't see anyone. That's okay. Scott, if someone has a pond that they've been operating historically that has never been permitted or reviewed or engineered, is there a way to bring that pond into compliance through the current mechanisms that are available?
Yeah, so that would likely be an unlicensed farm that wants to become licensed. Yeah, definitely. And I heard Patty a minute ago or a little while ago say she recommends no on-stream ponds, and I would agree with that. We've gone through the licensing process with an on-stream pond, and it was a nightmare. It's possible, but I would avoid that if at all possible. If you've got an existing pond that you would like to use, yeah, I think that's definitely possible. You have to prove, what the water source is for how that pond collects water, and then based on that, you would just follow a process. There's a few different variables in the path to getting that licensed. So I would just say that it would depend on the property, what that path would be. How's that for a non-answer?
No, it's true. There's so many site-specific variables, as Jacob said, that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for water storage strategies, but it's good to know. I think it's good to know that there is a way. It's not just, you're out because you're out, but that there is a way that you could bring these things into compliance and operate in the regulated market. In Mendocino County, we see a lot of these spring boxes. Patty, do you know about these spring boxes and how are they defined? Are they surface water diversions? Are they historical water rights? What's going on with the spring boxes?
I'm not sure about water rights. I don't know that anything is off the table anymore in terms of regulatory oversight. But if your spring is connected to the riparian and it's providing, flow enhancement to the stream, it could be subject to a regulatory, a permitting process. We'll see. It's emerging in terms of as we get less rainfall and water sources are scarce and people are trucking water, it seems to me like the regulatory agencies are going to have to do some kind of cost benefit about what's better, trucking water from a source and that may or may not be available in the future, or developing water that is not necessarily contributing to stream flow. So I don't really have an answer, except for that I am working with the landowner right now where the spring is subject to some analyses and potentially some regulatory limitations.
Great.
In my experience, I'd say if you're relying on a spring box, you've got a surface water diversion. I'd say that it's a high likelihood that those two are going to line up. I can't think of a time when we had a spring box that wasn't a surface water diversion.
Okay. Great, thank you. Jacob, could you talk a little bit about soil inoculation and what you're doing to help your soil hold more water?
Yeah, absolutely. So we practice biodynamics, which is a specific form of soil inoculation where we make certain preparations from herbs combined with farm animal wastes, and in composting them, we attract certain microorganisms that develop humus soils into those specific composts. And when we spray those on our soil, we're inoculating our entire gardens with these microbes. And so one of the biggest problems we're having with agriculture is topsoil erosion and the loss of these humus soils. I think we have probably like 1%. It changes every year, but the amount of topsoil we have left is astonishingly low, and we're losing it at a massive rate. And so this is what actually, most of our agriculture, all of the food we eat is dependent on these tiny amounts of this humus soil. And so what builds that is actually the microorganisms, and the microorganisms are recycling organic matter and other microbial life that has died, and they're reconsuming, and that builds up these topsoils that are like the traditional like black spongy soils with the crumb texture. And these soils actually hold much more water than our general agricultural soil that I think has 1% organic matter, is like the normal, is kind of the standard for our agricultural soils. And the more organic matter we can put into these soils, the more we can stimulate these microorganisms to consume that organic matter, the more we're left with a stable humus. And so the more humus we have, the more water that soil can hold. And really in the summertime, that's important, but it's more important with how much water that soil can soak up in the wintertime without running off. Because the more humus you have, the more you can soak up, the less water runs off, and the more that bank is there for when you actually need it in the summertime. And we're doing this on our farm with primarily with cattle. And so we're composting cattle manure. We're preparing it in this certain way with these herbs to attract certain microorganisms, and then spreading that and spraying that. And we've seen in combination with our wood chip and straw mulching, you know, a rapid increase in the topsoil that we build, and combining that with the water that we're trying to collect all winter long, and then our regular irrigation that comes from our rainwater storage, you know, we're able to grow a really high quality crop on our small farm.
Hey, can I ask a quick question, Jacob? Is some of this stuff covered in your book?
Yeah, all of these techniques are covered in our book, The Flower Days Farm Regenerative Guide to Cannabis, which I co-wrote with my wife, Carla. And yeah, that's all there. That's available for farmers to basically, you know, see how they can start to do it for themselves for lower costs. Because one of the things that is partly my personal interest in this whole thing is when we're doing agriculture and when we have this hydrologic cycle, the big thing that's missing is that we're taking that water, we're watering crops, we're growing it, and then we're exporting those crops. And so these crops, all of that water that we're using in this cycle is actually being exported. I mean, maybe not all of it, but what actually ends up in our tomatoes or our cannabis or whatever to grow that, we're exporting that to a different bioregion. And so like with the riparian right, you know, you have to keep that water in the same watershed for use, right? But then you're exporting that water through the crops you grow. And so as California starts to think about, you know, local farming and things like that, that is maybe more of the way we need to go, and doing less export and more just doing it for ourselves. And every region should be doing this way, because this is part of the problems we're seeing with our hydrologic cycle is if you're not letting all that water that goes into your food stay in your watershed, well, where does it go? You know what I mean? You're putting it at, it's going to, you know, those tomatoes that are grown in the Central Valley, they're going to New York, and New York doesn't need the water, but they're getting the California water in the food that they eat. So these are kinds of bigger picture things that I think we're going to need to start thinking about as the regulatory system kind of gets involved more with farming. And at the same time, one of the things that I see that, you know, hopefully good is going to happen, but maybe this is one of the things that I'm really concerned about, is that the daily fines are $1,000 for like, I know there's a bunch of curtailments in the Russian River right now. And so the curtailments, the fees for violating those drawing water at that time is $1,000 a day for the small user. But for the big user, it's $2,500 an acre foot. And so that's just cost of doing business. It's actually cheaper to pay the fine for the acre foot than to truck the water in. But for the small producer, who's maybe actually participating more in a local California economy and keeping that water in our own hydrologic process, they're being put out of business by these exorbitant fines when a large producer is, you know, can divert an acre foot for less than it would cost them to truck it.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of stuff that I'm seeing where, you know, hopefully we can make the right choices, you know, in the regulatory agencies to make sure that the outcomes that we want are actually the outcomes that we get, and we see our economies continue to thrive, rather than, you know, like a few really large producers being able to kind of do it as cost of doing business.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I think that's really insightful. I don't think I've ever thought about how much water we export through food, but I think that's a really insightful way of saying it. It's a real aha moment for me. So thank you so much for sharing your insights. Did you have something else to add?
I think that's it for now.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up, but I've really enjoyed talking with you all. Thank you so much for your time, Patty, Jacob, Scott. This presentation will be posted to YouTube, so you can check it out, share it with your friends, and we just appreciate everyone who participated today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.